White Ribbon. White Ribbon is a charity that couldn't have had more support. More cultural support, more community support and more financial support. It had about $20 million worth of donations and funding over the multiple years of its existence. But all of that money got piddled away up against the wall. So much so that now administrators are so desperate to try to claw back the $800,000 worth of debt that charity had, that they're trying to flog off anything they can to try and get money back. Have a look at some of the things that they are trying to sell to get money back to those who are still owed money by White Ribbon. $20 million is how much money was coming in the door, but they spent way more than that because they owed $800,000. They've still got 150,000 white ribbons. They've got bags of wristbands, they've got balloons, they've got aluminium drink bottles and oversized foam hands. That's how ridiculous the fire sale is to try and turn things around. Now, I have been screaming for someone to actually go on a deep dive here to try to work out how the hell did this go so wrong. This was a charity that, of course, was supported from the Prime Minister to footballers to normal people. There were hundreds of people who had events as late as this year to try to spread the message about how detestable domestic violence is, yet still, head office pissed the money away. I'm pleased to say that Paul Garvey is the reporter who has actually done the shoe leather to try to work out what's been happening here. He wrote a great piece in the Australian newspaper today and he joins us now from Perth. Paul, how the hell did they go from having $20 million through the door over the life of the charity, including $6 million this year, to a disgraceful debt of $800,000?
It's pretty remarkable, isn't it? And when you think about all the charities out there around Australia, for 99% of them, the biggest issue is getting another dollar through the door. They're sort of a hand-to-mouth existence. White Ribbon was almost the opposite problem. There was more and more money coming in year after year after year, and it basically entirely swamped that organisation. It needed to grow in response. It grew far too aggressively. It made a series of poor financial decisions, and it adopted a model which was just totally out of date for what most charities would use in the modern era. So there was expensive rents, there was excessive staff numbers. One little fact that I unearthed in pulling this story together was that the office had actually hired pot plants to make the office look a little bit prettier. That's great if you're a big bank or an accounting firm or a mining giant, but I think most people would agree that they want their charities to spend their money a bit more responsibly than that. Those plants went, but I think that sort of reset came far too late to actually save the organisation as a whole.
Because there was this turf fight between a new CEO and the board and all of that, and I know the personalities, when you try to dig through the ashes of something, can be sort of, you know, sidelines in and of themselves. I'm sure you could write 10,000 words down this rabbit hole and that rabbit hole. But how the hell did it happen that eminent Australians sitting around the board and a CEO didn't work out before this year what the fundamental problem was with what they were doing? Who was most derelict in their duty?
That's a big question. Look, I think everyone owns some collective blame there. There was a big board. There were some big names on that board. There were 3 CEOs in the past couple of years. There were a couple of chairmen as well. There was a whole lot of turnover, and any time you see high levels of turnover in a board, whether that's in a charity or a corporation, or if you see it in government, that's a massive red light. My feeling, having dived into this a bit there, is that I feel like portions of that board were too afraid, too nervous to actually act. I think there was at least one CEO in there in the past few years who could see the issues, who tried to do something about it. That meant shaking up that organisation in a pretty unpleasant way, but a necessary way. And I think the board just found it easier to part ways and you know, keep its head in the sand.
I mean, good on you for digging into this, but it feels to me like quite a disgrace that something as high profile, as cashed up and as well connected as White Ribbon, essentially it's collapsed as a 24-hour story and nobody's really, until yourself, been bothered to go sticking through it. Why is that? Is that because of the multiplicity of connections back through the media that this charity had? Is it simply too complicated? How did it take so long for someone like yourself to be able to at least start telling a story here? Because it feels like if this was any other charity, there would have been a lot more media interest in what had happened.
Perhaps. I mean, it might just be a more practical factor in that it is a very complex story. And unusually for me, generally, the more calls you make on a story, the clearer the picture becomes, the better the understanding is. For me, each call, everyone you spoke to, the story became more and more complex, and it was diving into things. You know, I've got a financial journalism background, so I was comfortable with the numbers, but trying to get my head around the nuance of preventative domestic violence measures, modern philanthropic corporate structures, and so on. There's a lot to this, and it's tricky ground to wade into as well when you have the overall domestic violence debate. You have abortion rights being discussed in here. That was quite a critical development in White Ribbon's evolution, which caused it some significant damage. There's a lot to it. So, you know, having put the hours in to try to pull the story together, I understand why people may have just been knocked off the trail. But there is a big story in all this because it was such a well-recognised charity. It did such a fantastic job in building that brand recognition, that penetration across the nation. It got a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't look at domestic violence as an issue to actually sit up and take some notice, even if it was only for one day a year, but it was a start. There were a lot of critics of the organisation. A lot of those criticisms were valid, but fundamentally the intention was there. It created a great movement nationwide, and it's tragic that it's gone the course that it has. And I think the real tragedy would be, one, if people decide not to fund charities anymore because they see this sort of waste occur. And two, if people suddenly think that because White Ribbon went under that domestic violence isn't an issue anymore, because that's certainly not the case.